So today we're really happy to be here speaking to Hanneke Boon, head of James Wharram Designs. Hanneke also co-designed the boats alongside the legendary multi-hull pioneer and designer James Wharram. So Hanneke, welcome. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at Wharram.
Well, I've spent most of my life with James, actually. I first met him when I was just 14. Um, my father was interested in his boats. This was in the 60s when James had fairly recently done his voyages, and he'd started selling designs in North Wales. And my father wanted to go and meet this unusual character he'd read about. And we ended up on the beach where James was living on his catamaran, which he did his first transatlantic crossings on. And we bought a set of plans for a 22-footer, and then we built that in Holland. So I'm originally from the Netherlands, and so we built that boat over about a year. And then we got to know James and Bruce very well during this period. And we did further trips to England to help them build their previous boat, which was a 51-footer called Tahini. So that was being built out in the open with hand tools in North Wales. This was 1968-69. And there's, in fact, a lovely film on YouTube about it. People can find that on our channel.
What can you tell me the name of the film?
It's called The Building of Tahini.
Okay, great.
And the Sailing of Tahini. It's on the James Wharram Designs YouTube channel. So
Okay.
yeah.
So we're up to 69. So keep going with your story. It's fascinating.
Yes, right. So we got to know James. I got to know him more. And a few years later, somehow I ended up sailing across the Atlantic on Tahini with James, Ruth, and several other girls that were part of the crew at the time. And that's where it all started. I'm trying to keep it brief, okay? Right from the beginning, I started doing drawing work. James really liked the way I was drawing. And so in fact, the Hinamoa plans, which are 23-footer we've got, I drew when I was 19 or something. And
Wow.
that was my first set of plans. And from then I've gone onwards drawing plans. And of course, more and more, we did a lot of design work together. New design we work on, we have a sort of brainstorm between us. I would be sketching and we would be having ideas, and then that evolved into a new design. And
Okay.
so that's how it's gone for years. And yeah, and of course, in the 80s, we started building a new boat. We built this 63-foot Spirit of Gaia. And we sailed that around the world then in the 90s. And I still got this boat, and I'm still sailing it, and it's in the Mediterranean at the moment. But over all the years, we've done lots of different design projects and different designs, and now we've sold over 10,000 sets of plans over all those years.
Oh my goodness.
And
Okay.
there's hundreds of these boats everywhere. And now with social media, there's a huge following, actually, people, Facebook groups, people talking about Wharram catamarans. Quite a lot are now being bought secondhand. There's old ones, classics, 40, something, even 50-year-old boats that are being bought by people. And then they lovingly try to restore them back into life.
Oh, that sounds amazing. So I think we should probably go back a little bit then and learn. Can you tell us a little bit about where the designs came from and who James was?
Well, James, of course, back in the 50s, he read a book called The Voyage of the Kaimiloa by a Frenchman called Eric the Bishop. And Eric the Bishop, just before the war, had been sailing in the Pacific on a Chinese junk, trying to work. He was very interested in Polynesian migrations, and he was studying the ocean currents and all sorts of things, making lots of notes. But unfortunately, he wrecked his junk in Hawaii. And well, they were starving on board because they had been held up in the Marshall Islands by the Japanese at the time. It was quite a story. And so he ended up there, and instead of building another junk, he built a double canoe on the beach in where was it? Anyway, in Hawaii. And then he sailed this boat together with his male companion, a Frenchman, all the way to France, through the Pacific, Indian Ocean, around Cape of Good Hope. and all the way into the Med to Toulon, which was an incredible voyage. And it showed how good a double canoe could sail. It wasn't totally Polynesian. The hulls were inspired by Polynesian boats, but he put a junk sail on it and various other junk elements because he was used to them. Anyway, James read this book in his teens, when out of the library, was very much inspired by it. And then, of course, Thor Heyerdahl came up with his Kon-Tiki voyage, who claimed that, you know, the Polynesians must have come from South America because of the ocean currents and the prevailing winds. But having read the Eric Bishop book, James was convinced that was not true, and Eric Bishop's theories of them coming out of Southeast Asia were correct, which they were, of course.
Right.
But, so he decided, and he wanted to go ocean sailing. So the easiest for him to build really was a double canoe. So with a very small budget, he built a 23-foot 6-inch double canoe, which
So
he called
did the
Tangaroa.
concept of catamaran even really exist at that point?
Not
Or?
really. No, there had been a Frenchman had built a steel heavy sort of catamaran and sailed it across the Atlantic. It was all a bit of a disaster story. But of course, there were the knowledge of the double canoes of the Pacific, Polynesian boats. And there was a book published called Canoes of Oceania by the Bishop Museum in Hawaii.
Okay.
Just also 1938-39. And that was in the library, and James studied that quite deeply when he was trying to design his boat. Also went to museums, studied models. Anyway, with that boat, they managed to sail from England to Trinidad. And there, well, the boat was too small. They suffered from tornado worm. It was built in softwood.
Wow.
So they built a 40-foot plywood catamaran called Rongo, and then sailed that up to New York, 1959 this was, and from New York to England. And that was the first west to east crossing by any multi-hull. And that's what they did. And then a few years later, they actually did a whole other Atlantic circuit. And in fact, that was also still the only catamaran that crossed the Atlantic that way. So that was all in 61.
That's remarkable.
Yeah. But they wanted to sail around the world, but very sadly, James's other partner, he was living with 2 German girls, women at the time. She died. And so it was a terrible shock to them. And with 1 crew member missing, they decided not to sail into the Pacific. But then he ended up settling down in Wales, and at some point, people asked for a design. Can you design me a boat like yours? And that's where it all took off in 1965. So he started then designing different size boats, and he developed some very good building techniques actually at that time, because he wanted always simplicity. He was not a particularly experienced sort of woodworker, so he always looked for simple methods. And you know, he was quite a bit inspired by an American book actually, Boat Building in Your Backyard, which he'd been given a long time ago by an American woman. And because in America they built a lot of quite simple dory style boats and things. So, but James developed a very interesting message, which was building the hulls upside down and building a plywood backbone and then slotting bulkheads onto it. Right. And that way people could get the accurate shape of a boat without difficult lofting or, you know, all this leveling and build. You didn't have to build a heavy building base. And that makes a huge difference. And in fact, all our designs are still built in that method. I mean, we've evolved it and made it more sophisticated, but we still use that upside down backbone and bulkhead methods, and it works extremely well.
So let's talk a little bit about design. In many ways, I would assume James is considered the sort of the father of modern catamarans. Like that's where the
he
design.
Certainly considered that, and he is really, because I think in the early days the majority of ocean-going catamarans were Wharram designs. I
So
mean, now the lagoons have taken over that.
yes.
But
Yeah,
that's
it
the
would
way.
be very interesting to have a coffee with you to see what you think of modern catamarans. But
Not
yes,
a great admirer of them, I'm afraid.
no, worms are certainly beautiful. But so in many ways, you'd say I guess compared to what's happened, the worm designs have evolved quite slowly. So why
Yeah,
is
well,
that?
differently, parallel, but very differently. We have always kept with the basic Polynesian principles of having separate hulls, having flexibility in the whole structure, and a general just simplicity. You know, the whole philosophy behind it is that you have a sailing boat, not a motorboat. You know, you can have motors, but a boat should be a good ocean sailing boat, and that's what the basics is behind the design. And we stuck with that. But we always keep simple, and we try to avoid a lot of hardware and complications, and you know, so all our designs now are basically ply epoxy built, which is an easy way for self-builders to work. But the plans are incredibly detailed, so we lead the builder right step by step through the whole process of how to build it. You know, they don't have to have technical drawing knowledge, how to read them. You know, it's all illustrative. See, I've always been good at drawing, so I'm an illustrative artist as well as a technical drawer.
Okay.
So our plans all consist of some measurement drawings, big drawings with measurements which you need, whatever, and then a whole book like a sketchbook of instructions, and they're all 3D drawings with sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 follow the text around it, you
Right.
know,
Yeah, I've
and
seen a few
help you to
photos.
get,
They look like a work of art.
yeah. And I don't use a computer to draw. I draw by hand. I stick with
So
that.
how have the designs evolved then from the early ones?
How have they designed? Well, with the introduction of epoxy, you see, epoxies came in around about 1980. You know,
Okay.
the Gujans were working on them in the late 70s, and we met them at the time. And in fact, we listened to one of their talks back in 76, I was, I think. There was a big
Right.
multi-hull conference in Toronto. There's all the multi-hull designers there, and the Gujans were there. And so very early on. And James was quite intrigued by it, but a little bit skeptical when they said it was, you see, it's wood epoxy saturation technique. That's what WES
Right.
stands for. The saturation bit, James sort of questioned that. Well, how deep does it saturate? But in actual fact, it's more of a coating than a saturation. But that's beside the point. But the whole system of using epoxy gave us a whole new method, really, by using epoxy fillets. You know, the woodworking skills can be reduced. You don't have to have absolute accurate jointing and everything, because the
Right.
epoxy will take care of that. And as long as you teach people how to use the epoxy correctly. And of course, the whole coating of all the wood and the glassing on the outside makes the boat much more durable than the earlier ones were, you know, because you're sealing things up. And it allowed us to do a lot more sophisticated design work, really, with, you know, just all in plywood, cutting it and fitting it together with epoxy. And we started in 1981 with stitch and glue boats.
Okay.
And so we developed our whole tiki range in stitch and glue with the small ones. And again, that really made us focus on how to make boat building really simple. And our smaller tikis, the stitch and glue ones, are really very simple to build, and consistent in simplicity. You know, the same technique is used throughout, and not at the end suddenly gets complicated. You know, when
Right.
it can happen. You know, okay,
Yes. Yeah,
the
you're
hull
going
can be
fine.
simple, but then we didn't want to make it suddenly complicated when it came to masts and other things. So that's all been part of, and that was very much James was behind this. That's what he wanted. He wanted it consistently simple techniques throughout. And
Okay.
then these tikis just evolved bigger and bigger, and every time you go bigger, you have to work out different ways of doing it, so you get the correct strength, the right balance, you know, and that's what we worked on. And I did a lot of work on that kind of thing, of working out techniques of how to achieve it easy and simple.
So we encountered many Wharram catamarans in harbors around the world, and we saw them in the harbors, and they're always very beautiful to look at. But I always wondered what they were like to sail.
Well, they slip through the water very easy, actually, because we've always had slim hulls. You know, all our hulls are at least 11 or 12 to 1 beam length ratio on the waterline. And
Okay.
actually, a lot of these modern catamarans, they're about 8 to 1. They're much fatter. And they're about,
Right.
I
Yes.
mean, if you want them to go fast, you've got to put a lot of sail on it. Whereas our boats will sail with very little sail, actually, even with reefed sails. At the moment, you've got a force 4. On our boat, we can reduce the sail area to nearly half of it and not lose much speed. I mean, we never aim for sort of these really high speeds, but our 63-footer will sail happy at 9-10 knots. And the moment you've got more wind, it will sail that with half the sail area. And so
Right.
it's, you know, it's a lovely passage making boat on a lot of them are. And because they flex, they go with the waves, and they're fairly low freeboard, so you're much more connected to the ocean through the boat.
Mm, that's
But
lovely.
they're more simple. You know, some people say they're Spartan, which they may be, but it's that simplicity that attracts a lot of our builders, actually.
So let's
They're so
talk about the
tired of seeing all this kind of complication and people having everything they have at home on their boats. And they say, I don't want that. I want to sail. I want to be simple. I don't want things to go wrong. And so they choose the Wharram catamaran for that reason.
Tell me a little bit more about the people who choose the cats. I know you talked about that there's a real resurgence in interest, and it sounds like it's the people looking for simplicity.
Yes, definitely. It's a kind of way of life as well as a type of boat. And of course, our boats have a kind of timeless look. We've not gone with the fashion of boat fashions. You know, now fashions every year you need a new model like cars. We haven't gone that way. We stick, because the boats are based on a traditional craft from the past, the historic craft. We stay much more within traditional lines and you know, shear lines, overhangs, and things like that, which we feel work. You know, so our boats still have overhangs at the bow, whereas now all the other catamarans have that up and down straight bows, or even retro bows. That's now the fashion. That's what you've got to have, whereas we don't believe in it. And the other thing, of course, we've always stuck with V hulls, V cross section, slight curve V. And I still feel that it's got canoe stern, so even if you load them, you'll never drag a transom wave behind the boat. And they slip really through the water well, actually, because they kind of slice the ocean open with a V. Whereas if you've got a big round, you kind of push it downwards. And I think that has a different effect on the water. And of course, a V, the lower you go below the water, the slimmer the hull gets. You know, if you have a beam length ratio of 12 to 1 on the actual sea level waterline, every time you go down, say 6 inches, the waterline is slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. So at the bottom, you're cutting it with a knife. And of course, we don't need any keels or decker boards as a result. And,
Okay.
you know, all the people that sail our boats swear by them, others not. So
Right. So it's a matter of sailing them. So you've talked about new builders who are finding the old boats and redoing them. What kind of people are doing them? Is it a cross section or?
I don't know, there's all sorts of people that are rebuilding boats. But actually, one interesting thing that's been happening, there have been a number of women buying old Wharram catamarans and doing them up. And in fact, there's a very large following on Instagram for a woman called Kiana. What's her name? Anyway, she's Kiana, and her Instagram account is Women in the Wind. And she got a 50-year-old Wharram catamaran and has now sailed it 4 times across the Atlantic, 3 of mostly single-handed, and once with 2 other women, and they reported on that a lot. And they do some beautiful romantic reporting, actually. I mean, the boat is simple and it's leaks, but she loves it. and it's rigged kind of with natural spars, you know, made from trees, because it was all sort of helped with a friend. It's a fascinating Swiss chap called Hans Klaar, who built a really genuine ethnic double canoe in West Africa, and he's been sailing around the Atlantic now for many years with it. And this woman met him, and he's helped her, turn his boat into a new style boat. It was very simple, and a rig that's kind of just a rebuilt rig from older sails, with trees at spars, and it's beautiful. Everything's lashed, and there've been now a number of women that have been doing that too.
That's got to be really gratifying. Oh, sorry. Oh, I was going to say it must be very gratifying to see these 50-year-old boats still having such a beautiful life.
Yeah, and it's also a lifestyle. People just love that kind of basic connection with the ocean. None of this trying to bring your hotel room on the sea, but keeping really connecting with it in a basic way, like people used to sail many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then there's other people. I mean, there's a young man, Englishman at the moment, who's found a 42-footer Pi 42 in Holland, which he managed to buy. Somebody built it beautifully, actually, but never finished it. It was in the water. It was 2 holes and beams and some windows that weren't really fitted on. And it'd been lying there for, I don't know, 7, 8 years, 9 years, filling with water. And it looked a mess. It was filthy and horrible. And he and I had a look at it over WhatsApp. And I said to him, that boat looks well built. Buy it. And he bought it for 2,000 euros only, which is the price of plans.
Right.
Now got, well, and then actually, which was fascinating, because everybody thought, my God, what's he buying? Because then he started cleaning, and he recorded all the cleaning. And as the dirt came off, this kind of rather beautiful boat came out from underneath the filth. And the bilges had been full of water, but because they were so well sealed with epoxy, which shows again,
yeah,
no rot down there at all. And there's only rot patches is because these windows weren't put in properly and holes were drilled.
Right.
So otherwise, the boat is in very good order. It's just
so so it sounds like the office is still very active with you there. And is it mainly people getting in touch with you for information about boats, or are people still buying new plans?
Buying plans and building new boats, and I've got some really good people working in the office here. And I've got, a woman who sends out all the plans. I've got a man who does our website, who lives actually on site here. I've got now a lovely young woman called Tori, who's now taken on the Instagram and more social media aspects of it. And so it works really well. And I've actually been going off sailing quite a bit.
Oh, good for you.
Still got this. Well, James died 18 months ago about.
Right.
And soon after, I was offered to sail across the Atlantic with some German friends who've got a sister ship to our own. And I took that offer up. So that was spring last year, January to April, I was sailing the Atlantic. And then in the autumn, we got our Spirit of Gaia and sailed it from Greece to Sicily. And this springtime, I sailed it from Sicily to Ibiza in the Mediterranean. And in September, I want to carry on the voyage to Portugal, which is where I'm aiming for. And I want to do an all-woman sail myself. So I'm looking for women.
Amazing.
So anybody, I've already got probably 2 or 3. They're not all certain yet. But
that sounds remarkable. Well, thank you, Hanneke. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, and it sounds like James has a beautiful legacy. Can you let me know how people can reach you?
Yeah. Sorry, how to reach you? Well, first of all, our website is wharram.com.
Okay.
WHARRAM.com. And of course, we have a YouTube channel as well called James Wharram Designs.
Okay.
But they can all be found via the website.
Okay.
And of course, James and I wrote a book, autobiography, not so long ago, which was published 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And that gives our whole life story and everything about the boat designs and how we built and how we sailed around the world, etc. And there's a lot of YouTube videos can be found through our website again. And once you're in the website, you can read there for hours. It's not just a selling of designs. It gives all the philosophy and, you know, ideas and articles about things. So.
Well, thank you so much, Hanneke. I really appreciate you taking the time today to speak to us at the CAT site.